Hi, in my last video I looked at a recent purchase of mine which was a Bachmann V1/V3 class 262 locomotive. Now I've got two of these from Bachmann, and the one I bought more recently was ironically the older of the two, but it was at a bargain price off eBay. Now the difference between the two we'll have a look at in a little while, but you can see that the one at the top is in a much bigger box with the current of 2022 Bachmann style branding with the blue box and the red stripe along the bottom, and that is a Dcc Ready model. You can tell that, well, first of all you can tell it by simply reading the end of the box, but I'll go into how you can tell if you're simply looking at a second-hand model and wondering whether it's Dcc Ready or whether it's the older style like this one. So in a recent video I watched by Sam of Sam's Trains, he was quite scathing of the V1. I'm going to call it V1 from now on. It might be a V1, might be a V3. The differences I don't know. It's about something to do with boiler pressure, I think. Maybe cylinder size as well. Anyway, he was very scathing of the more recent model, and this is the more recent model, Dcc Ready. Well, he was scathing about the bodywork. He said the chassis was a brilliant runner, and I can agree 100% with that. But he was very critical of the body because the body dates from 1990 or 1991, something like that. Well, for a start, let's get things in perspective. The recommended retail price apparently of this model was $129.95. Whoever was selling it eventually sold it for $73.99. I bought it second hand off eBay and it was about £40 including postage. So yeah, if you thought a model cost £74 brand new, you might expect to pay about £40 for it second hand, who knows. But it was a real bargain, I have to say. I think I was lucky to pick up one so cheaply. But we'll have a look at both of them. And is the body really as bad as Sam described? I think he was being a bit harsh there. So first of all, and I have shown this one in a previous video, but here is the old style V1. Now let me get it out of the box. It's got the old flap there, and on the front I think it describes the super smooth flywheel gear drive motor. We'll come back to that in a while. It's still got the detail pack, well, detail pack, 2 vacuum pipes and brake rigging. I say detail pack, look, it's actually got, I don't know if you can see there, it's got driver and fireman in the cab. There's not a lot of detail in the cab, there's no back head detail at all, but there are 2 chaps in the cab. So there's the model. Let me get the camera down a bit lower. So here's the model of dating from 1991, and I think you'll agree the livery is superb. It's got very fine lining on the tank sides, and all over I think the lining is brilliant. I think it's and the livery is brilliant. And you see at the front the buffer beam. I hope the camera is focusing on that. The buffer beam is nicely picked out with a little white lining, and it's got bits of writing on it, the number of the locomotive and something else underneath. Gateshead, I think it says Gateshead underneath, the shed where it was allocated presumably. But when this came out in 1991 I believe, and it really was, for a model railway locomotive ready to run, state of the art. I don't know if you can see, but it's got a separately fitted lamp irons, it's got a separately fitted smoke box dart, and everything about it I think is fantastic. It's just the look of it, the livery, the detail. It's got lots of separately fitted handrails at a time when Hornby's offerings were really quite basic in comparison. The Hornby models of the same time typically just had handrails on the boiler, nothing else, moulded smoke box dart, no lamp irons at all, and typically they picked up from only maybe 4 wheels. If you think back to the Hornby tank engines of the time, the centre wheels, if they were 6-coupled locomotives, the centre wheels were often well, they had a smaller centre wheel with a smaller flange. Some of them had a traction tyre on the centre wheel, but they typically had a smaller wheel with a smaller flange, and therefore that it didn't pick up electricity from the centre wheel. And that was typical of the Hornby offerings of the period. They only picked up from 2 wheels on each side. In contrast, if I turn this over, you can see the chassis. Our locomotive here picks up from all 6 driving wheels and also from the 2 pony wheels at the front. So it had 8-wheel pickup, which even by modern standards for a tank engine is pretty good. For example, the Oxford Rail N7, which is an 062, that could potentially have 8-wheel pickup, but it doesn't. So here we are, 1990s design. It really impressed when it came out. The one reservation about this locomotive, which I mentioned in my previous video, was the fact that it has the Bachmann split chassis. That's to say, it has 2 heavy metal blocks separated by a little plastic insulator, and it has, as a result, it has axles that are plastic that attach to the 2 metal wheels, and the plastic tends to split rather easily. And that is the cause of running problems on quite a few of the older models, if they've been badly handled or if they just wear out with time. I know, I've heard of metal fatigue. I guess there's plastic fatigue as well, and the plastic does tend to deteriorate over time. So that's the 1990s model. Another thing I should add is that the original 1990s model had just plain metal valve gear and motion and coupling rods and so on, whereas this is a later version to the same design with chemically blackened metalwork, which looks much better. But even so, it was still a good looking model at the time back in the 1990s. And I have a feeling that it was one of Bachmann's very first own designs. Prior to that, they had simply taken the designs of Mainline, who had been around in the late 70s up till the sort of mid-80s, and had produced some really good-looking locomotives. But they took their designs and they re-engineered the chassis. So the chassis has what Bachmann described as their flywheel drive, super smooth flywheel. Where are we? There we go. Super smooth flywheel gear drive motor. Basically, the worm gear was quite thick, which gave it a slight flywheel effect. Not particularly significant. I mean, if a flywheel's going to do anything, it's got to be quite chunky. And if it simply compensates for the fact that your motor is very, very small and so has a very lightweight armature, then the flywheel helps, but it's not going to make a massive difference. It's not going to make a poorly designed or poorly put together motor and chassis run well, put it that way. So that was the 1990s version. Now here is the 2000 and well, I think it came out about 2019, this version. So this is now the Dcc Ready version. The only change, the bodywork is the same, exactly the same moulding, the same level of detail on it. The only thing that has changed is that the chassis is different, and whereas the original had moulded drain cocks, with the new model you've got separate drain cocks that you can fit yourself if you wish. And how can you tell, if you're buying an unboxed model, how can you tell if it's DCC Ready or if it's the split chassis version, which is hard to DCC fit? Well, what you do is you look underneath. The DCC version has wiper pickups on the wheels, whereas the original picks up through the axle themselves. The original has pickups on the front pony wheels, as I said. The DCC version doesn't, so it's actually a step back in that sense. It only picks up from the 6 driving wheels. And the other difference is you've got a traditional style of pony truck there on the older model, whereas the newer one, it's just a a wheel that has sort of quite a lot of freedom of movement, rocking up and down, side to side, forward and backwards, in a narrower bit of chassis, allowing the locomotive to go round pretty sharp curves. I think the original claimed it could go round first radius curves. I wouldn't recommend first radius curves because it's actually quite a long wheelbase. I haven't tried, I haven't got the first radius curves at the moment to try either of these two on. The more modern version, I suspect, is designed for second radius curves. And in fact, compared to a lot of six-coupled locomotives, these have got quite a long wheelbase. There's quite a gap between the first and second wheels, and an even bigger gap between the second and third. So, if you're hoping for something to run well on first radius, this is probably not it. But there we go. Now, one thing Sam pointed out in his review was that this was an excellent runner. I agree. I'm lucky that this one, for me, is also an excellent runner, but I know it's more hit and miss with those. I think I'll get them out on the layout now. Oh, before I do, just one other thing to remember that Sam did point out. On the top of both locomotives, there is a very noticeable moulding line. I don't know if you can see that. Will it focus properly? There is a definite moulding line on the top of the boiler. It's more noticeable on the green model than on the black one. But yeah, that's not quite up to 21st century standards maybe. But in every other respect, this locomotive I think is still looking the part, even though the mouldings is 30 years old. Because to be honest, you know, it was the best in its day 30 years ago. It still holds its own. It's still every bit as good, if not better, than any of the Hornby railroad models. And at the prices I paid for these two, they're cheaper than any of the Hornby railroad models apart from the 040s. So, you know, you're getting an awfully good quality model, really, for your money. So let's watch these two tank locomotives in action, and then I'll show you three more LNER tank locomotives that you might want to consider as an alternative to the V1, and I'll give you their pros and cons. So there goes the 1990s design V1. Hauling 3 Ian Kirk Gresley coaches, looking rather smart. Meanwhile, on the inner track, the other V1, this is the Dcc Ready version, is hauling 4 Hornby Gresley suburban coaches. So, two very good smooth runners. Let's see the alternatives now. Alongside the V1 on the right of the platform, right hand side as we view it, on the left there is the British Railways L1, designed by Edward Thompson. They came into operation in about, I don't know, 1946, something like that, I believe. And they were designed to replace engines like the V1, but they weren't particularly popular, and they didn't do that well as a replacement. Anyway, the V1 model by Hornby is excellent, detail-wise, very, very fine, very delicate fittings, and it does look more subtle, if you like, than the V1. But I think one thing I'd say is that chassis is not an improvement. Certainly not an improvement on the Bachmann more recent DCC chassis. The V1 has a very strange front pony truck that is very prone to derailing, and I've had to put extra lead weight on mine and alter the way it's attached to the chassis to stop it from derailing. My track's not perfect, but I don't think I should have to do that. I mean, most of my locomotives run perfectly on the track. It's just the odd one, and it's interesting, it's quite a few of the Hornby locomotives that have a single wheel pony truck at the front that cause the derailment. So I think it's their design more than my track. Anyway, let's get the L1 going. Smooth, but actually just as noisy, actually a bit jerkier if anything than the V1, I would say. Hasn't run for a while, I'll give it a few laps. You have to put up with the noise of traffic going past in the background because my layout is in the garage right up against the road. Meanwhile, on the inner track we have another alternative. That's the Oxford Rail N7. The N7 was a Great Eastern Railways design, so pre-LNER in fact, and the model came out about 5 years ago, I would think, and has had very good reviews. It's a much simpler model in some respects. It doesn't have any valve gear. It's inside valve gear, so you can't see them, you don't model them. And a simple, well, reasonably simple livery, but I do think it's well executed. Yeah, I've seen quite a few of them for sale second-hand as non-runners. I just wonder if Oxford Rail's quality control wasn't perfect, or if the design wasn't perfect. I'm fairly pleased with mine though. It's stalled. Hasn't run for... That was a really poor start first time round, but my N7 hasn't run for several months, in fact. It's been sitting in a siding gathering dust. It's a sign of the fact that I've probably got too many locomotives, to be honest. Anyway, I'm going to see if it'll start better this time. It's done a couple of laps to warm up. Let's see if we can get it to smoothly accelerate. Well, that's more like it. So there we are, that's the N7. I'll just bring it slightly nearer the camera. and rotate round a bit. Yeah, once it had overcome that bit of stuttering at the start, I left that into the video because I wanted to see that, you know, any locomotive, if it's been sitting around for a few months, can be pretty bad when you first try it out. But now that it's warmed up, and I haven't actually cleaned the wheels or anything, I just let it run round once and off it went. So yeah, beautifully smooth and fairly quiet. I only have one real criticism of the N7, and it might seem a trivial one, but for such a delicate and beautifully made model, the front coupling sticks out too far. I wish Oxford Rail had designed it so that it didn't stick out quite so far. It really is, I mean, it's probably about a centimetre. The actual coupling bar is probably about a centimetre ahead of the buffers, when in a lot of locomotives it's only a couple of millimetres in front. It doesn't need to be that far ahead. But anyway, that's just my view. My final sort of tank locomotive to look at, an alternative to a V1 or V3, is this N2 062 that was first produced. I believe the model was designed by Airfix, because it does look like it's got the Airfix 5-pole motor that they used on the 1400 class and on the large Prairie back in the late 70s when they introduced those. So I suspect the N2 was designed by Airfix. Don't think it was released by Airfix. I think it first came out when Airfix were taken over by Mainline, and I first bought, I think it was a Dapol version of this back in the early 90s, so it dates from a similar era to the V1. It's and bodywork wise, it's very similar. It's got lots of separate fitted handrails. It doesn't have the lamp irons that the V1 has. It also is a much simpler locomotive in that it doesn't have any valve gear. So there's less to go wrong, if you like, with this model. This is not the first one I've owned. This I got a few years ago, second hand, and it's quite a good runner. The early ones that Dapol and Mainline produced, the chassis wasn't quite right. The motor is very powerful, but it's a bit rough and ready. It's very noisy often, and this was one of the failings of the locomotive. Also, it's not heavy enough. The haulage capacity going around fairly tight curves is really limited because of again, it's got quite a long wheelbase, and I found mine struggled with more than 3 or 4 coaches. Anyway, this is a later version. I think it might be, let me just check. Sorry, I just took it off the track, had a look underneath. It's actually the Airfix, it says actually it's made in Airfix Hong Kong. So yeah, it's one of the very earliest models, but this one is a very quiet runner. I don't know if someone previous owner had looked after it very well or just never used it. I'm just lucky because I have seen and come across some that were quite rough. Now, eventually Hornby took over this model, and for a long time carried on producing it in exactly the same way. But in very recent years, they replaced the original 5-pole motor with a much smaller 5-pole can motor, the sort that you find in things like the Loco Drive A3 and A4, and you'd think that would make it a much better runner. But I found that, again, the locomotive is not very well balanced. You might just be able to see, I don't know if you can see the armature of the open frame motor there, big open frame motor. All the weight seems to be sort of on the back wheel, which means the traction of the locomotive is not brilliant. It's much lighter than the V1, and in fact the first model I ever owned, I put a huge block of lead in the front of the smoke box to try and give the model more traction, and it worked to an extent, but it was still such a noisy model. In the end, I decided to get rid of it. This one, as I say, is a much better runner, but even with the newer type Hornby motor, I still think the chassis is not quite right, and Hornby should have, instead of just replacing the motor, I think they should have completely redesigned the chassis to give it a lot more weight, because in reality an N2 was quite a powerful tank locomotive, and it would pull long trains out of places like King's Cross, long suburban trains, maybe 10 non-corridor coaches long, that sort of size. So this model doesn't quite have the haulage capacity. Anyway, let's see it running. So there you have it, the Airfix or Airfix N2 designed by Gresley. I think I'm quite lucky that although mine must have been built in the late 80s, this, or mid 80s, who knows when, it's a good runner. I have come across some that are much worse than this, much noisier, much more jerky. So it's a bit of hit and miss when you're looking for an N2. Like it is when you buy one of the early Bachmann split chassis V1s, because you don't know how well it's been looked after, you don't know if the axles have split or anything like that. But it's another good looking locomotive, and when it came out, again, it was state of the art in terms of British model railway locomotives, beautifully detailed, attractive livery and so on. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed that little look at some LNER passenger tank locomotives. I don't think I've forgotten any that are ready to run. If I have, please let me know. Most of the other LNER tank locomotives are very much like station pilots, things like the J50, J52, J72, rather than specialist passenger tank locomotives. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video and enjoy your railway modelling. Bye for now.